Hi guys, in this video I cover the do loop. I start out with a flowchart and then I go over an example. Let's start out with a flowchart. In a basic program we have statements and we execute them sequentially. Now the do loop uses a do keyword followed by a code block. When the program encounters the do keyword, it will simply execute the statements in the following code block. There is no check, no condition. It simply executes the condition in a new code block. Now at the end of the code block, there is a condition, similar like a while loop, and it uses the while keyword. This condition is evaluated to false or to true. If it is true, the block is executed a second time. If it is false, it will not be executed a second time and the program flow continues. Now what you may have noticed is there was no condition and the condition happened after the code block. That means we always execute the code block at least once. We execute the code block, condition is evaluated. If it's true, it executed again. Now that the statements are executed a second time, the condition is checked again. So it will be checked over and over again. Similar like a while loop, something in the code block has to affect the condition so that the condition eventually becomes false. If nothing affects the condition, we have an infinite loop, and this will be repeated over and over again indefinitely. When the condition evaluates to false, the program continues. Now let's take a look at the syntax. The syntax here is we have a do keyword followed by a code block. So the code block has some statements, and at the end of the code block there's a while keyword with a condition ending with a semicolon. The do simply says do execute the statements in the code block as long as the condition is true, or more closely, do execute this code block while the condition is true. Now, what is the difference between a while loop and a do loop? So while loop happens 0 to n times. A do loop happens 1 to n times. This one is executed at least once, and n times is determined by the number of times the condition is true. Now here, the condition, if it's false the first time, obviously it still occurred once. So the difference is the code block in a while loop is optional. In a do loop, it is guaranteed to be executed. Now let's take a look at an example. I use the scanner class and create a scanner object to read from the console. And I output a prompt. Enter a positive value. Now this value I store in the val variable. And now, since I'm using a do while loop, and I want to do something similar like I did in the video on while loops. In the video on while loops, I just simply evaluated this and repeated it if it's false. In this case, what I want to do is I want to use do while loop, and the very first time I already want to execute these two statements. So I wrap this block with a do loop and use these two statements inside my code block of the condition. So this one I leave as a comment. I fill that out in a little bit. So now I have the code block, and what this basically says is I create a scanner object and then I do execute and prompt for a positive value. I read the value and now I want to evaluate it. So this one is guaranteed to execute at least once. And I want to execute it again if the value is negative. Now what you may notice, and this is kind of like a common thing with do while loops, is when I put a condition here, let's say I want to repeat this as long as val is negative, I get a compile error. Val cannot be resolved to a variable. This is very common when writing do loops. The issue is that we have a code block and the scope of the val variable is only inside the code block. So this is the scope, and what the scope means here is that this variable no longer exists outside the code block. Now what we have to do is simply declare the variable before the code block. That way it continues to exist until the end of the program, until the end of the main. And then here we change this to just the initialization. So we declare it before and we initialize it here, or we assign it here whenever we execute the code block again. Now what this will do is, I will create the scanner, declare the variable, prompt for a positive value, read in that value into the val variable, and then check if the value in val is less than 0. If it's less than 0, it goes back, executes these statements again, reads in a new value, evaluates the new value. If it is still less than 0, it does it again. So it does it as long as val is less than 0. Now let's execute and see how this works. So it prompts for a positive value. I on purpose enter something negative, let's say -3. That's -3, so it goes back, prompts again. -5. It's still, the condition is still true, it's still less than 0, so it prompts again. Now -4, it prompts again. And now if I enter something positive, this condition is false because +2 is not less than 0, and then the program will start running. So there's no longer the prompt that it repeated. Now you could, if you compare this to a while loop, in the while loop we would have more statements, right? We would have to write a new message and we would have to duplicate this one. This one is very concise. The disadvantage here is, for this specific example, that we don't have a custom prompt. We don't have output invalid value, or we can customize it when something is wrong. So it's always the exact same message. There are other use cases for a do loop as well, but in general, think of a do loop whenever you want to do something at least once, write a do loop. Don't write the code once before, use a while loop, and then copy and paste the code in the while loop. That's what the do loop really is for. That if you have code that runs at least once, use a do loop, not a while loop. And obviously the condition here can be as complex as you like as well. We can also have another condition inside. So we could, in theory, also change this one to if val is less than 0, I output a message here. Print line invalid input. So we can nest loops, we can nest conditions, whatever we want to do. If we want to customize it a little bit, we can do this. So let's execute this to demonstrate it one more time. If I now put -4, we can see with the do loop, we still get invalid input, and then we prompt for a new message. And if we enter something positive, it stops right there. So this is how we can customize messages if the condition is false as well. What's important is that whenever we have loops, that we put some kind of condition that it eventually ends, and that we write statements here that affect this condition to be eventually false. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.